Hello there and welcome back to the Business of Story, your resource for learning from the top business and organizational storytelling minds from around the world. If this is your first time here, I'm your host, Park Howell. We've been helping listeners like you excel through the stories you tell for more than 20 years. And today, we're focusing on how effective storytelling is critical to change management within companies. My good friend Tamsen Webster joins us to share insights from her new book, Say What They Can't Unhear, the 9 Principles of Lasting Change. You'll learn some of those principles as Tamsen takes us on her journey in change management and communication, emphasizing the importance of understanding how adults learn and the need for effective storytelling strategies to get people to buy into and prosper from your change initiatives. Because, as Tamsen points out, the risk of change lands squarely on the shoulders of the initiator. Before we get to Tamsen, I want to share a book with you that I just finished and I absolutely loved. Now, have you ever had an idea that you were certain was going to be a winner, that would take the market by storm, customers would love it, but it flopped? Like really inexplicably blew up in your face? Hey, we've all been there. Well, this book helps you overcome the dreadful beast of failure, as author Alberto Savoia calls it. His book is The Right It: Why So Many Ideas Fail and How to Make Sure Yours Succeed. Now, my friend, former client, and current colleague, Sean Schroeder, recommended the book to me. He and I, with the help of Ron Pluth, are in the throes of developing the story cycle system AI Analyst that will reduce the typical 6 to 16 weeks of creating a brand story strategy down to about an hour. We've prototyped our product, a term Alberto coined in his book, and we believe we have the right it for a dynamic market. Business owners and marketing officers that need to develop their brand story quickly and correctly. Alberto is a great source. He is the former director of engineering and innovation adjutor at Google and currently teaches at Stanford while consulting with many businesses. Believe it or not, the ABT, that's the and, but, therefore narrative framework for you new listeners, shows up at the beginning of Alberto's process to determine if what you're working on is the right it or the wrong it. He calls it your market engagement hypothesis, or MEH for short. Once you have your idea, the market engagement hypothesis is a high-level description that combines the fundamental premise behind a new product idea with a vision of how the target market will engage with it. Throughout the book, he uses a case study for an idea called second-day sushi, inexpensive sushi for sushi lovers. His meh for the second-day sushi is this, quote, "A lot of people who want to eat healthy and who like sushi can't afford to eat it regularly because sushi tends to be quite expensive. If we can find a way to make sushi as affordable as other fast food, a lot of fast food patrons will choose sushi over less healthy alternatives." The structure of the ABT, using the 3 forces of story of agreement, contradiction, and consequence, are inherent in this market engagement hypothesis. Let me tweak it just a little bit so they really stand out. Quote, "A lot of people want to eat healthy and like sushi, but they can't afford to eat it regularly because sushi tends to be quite expensive. Therefore, if we can find a way to make sushi as affordable as other fast food, a lot of fast food patrons will choose sushi over less healthy alternatives." Now, Alberto is probably not aware of the ABT and created his meh statements intuitively using the ABT form, because all great brands and market category designers/creators come by the omnipresent form of the ABT naturally. Just like legendary Silicon marketer Christopher Lochhead did, who famously said,
"So you gave me a gift with the ABT. In category design, we have this thing called a POV, a point of view. And it is simply structured very similarly to that of the ABT, which is essentially, and this is such a profound insight, it sounds like it's nothing, just like the ABT. In a point of view, it goes like this. Nobody buys a solution until they have a problem. And so a point of view starts with framing, naming, and claiming a problem. And when people understand the problem/opportunity, then they become interested in the solution. And then, of course, the third piece from a POV perspective is how your product or service, or your idea for that matter, you might not be actually marketing or selling anything, bridges the gap between the problem/opportunity and therefore the solution. Okay, so with all that said, why do I love the ABT? The ABT takes the thinking that we did around points of view and does a fantastic, legendary double click on it. And that's why the and, but, and therefore model is pure genius. It allows you to relate to people. Then it gives them the but, which tees up the problem. And then the therefore, which points the way to the different future, aka solution. And it's easily rememberable. Blah, blah, blah. And if you start to play with it, as I have since you taught it to me, just like anything else, you develop some prowess with it, starts working. You're like, wow, it's almost weird how this works.
You could see the similarities. Lockett's brand point of view is like Alberto's market engagement hypothesis. You identify your audience, really articulate what problem you will solve for that audience, and then, of course, how you are uniquely equipped to do it. At least that's your hypothesis, or that's the point of view that you want to design in the brand category within the minds of your audiences, right? So, if you have an idea for a fabulous new product, an amazing new service, or trying to simply initiate a change idea within your organization, then I highly recommend reading The Right It and defeat that beast of failure, which, by the way, is pretty much the theme for today's show. So, how do you present your idea, your big it, to get people to buy in? Well, Tamsen has some big ideas of her own.
If humans are not given all the pieces of the story that we need for things to make sense, we will fill in the story based on the beliefs, the experiences, the values, the assumptions that we already have. So when you don't say to people, here's why we're doing this, when you don't say to people, this is why we're doing it this way, based on these principles about why we think this is going to work, then people will fill in. And if they haven't had a good experience to date with you thinking about that, not going to fly.
Part message designer, part English to English translator, part magpie. Tamsen Webster helps leaders craft their case for large-scale change. In addition to her work in and for major organizations such as Harvard Medical School, Fidelity Investments, and Klaviyo, she's a judge and mentor for the Harvard Innovation Labs, a professional advisor at the Martin Trust Center for MIT Entrepreneurship, and has spent over 10 years as the idea strategist for one of only 9 legacy-level TEDx events in the world. She was named to the Thinkers 50 radar in 2022 and is author of 2 books, Find Your Red Thread, Make Your Big Ideas Irresistible, and what we're going to be talking about today, Say What They Can't Unhear. She lives in Boston with her husband, 2 sons, and 2 brindle greyhounds, Hazel and Walnut. So please welcome to the Business of Story, Tamsen Webster. Tamsen, welcome back to the Business of Story.
I'm so glad to be here in the Business of Story with you, Bart.
Well, it's your 3rd appearance in 8 years. That's awesome. I think you're right up there at the top of the leaderboard of some of the other guests, but you...
Yes! I'm going to crush it.
Well, you're always cranking out such great content information, and you've got this new book that when I saw it hit the stands, I go, oh my goodness, I got to see if I can carve out a little time on Tamsen's schedule. So I know how busy you have been. You are also right now working on your PhD, you told me.
On my EDD, yes.
EDD.
Yes, I started a doctoral program this summer in adult learning and leadership at Columbia.
Wow, and how long of a program is that?
That is 2 years of coursework and then the dissertation, whatever, however long that takes. So yes, I've started that, but I started it because I've spent, as you know, the 25 plus years of my career really focused on the sender side of information. And I've endlessly fascinated on how we accelerate the understanding and adoption of new ideas. And it struck me that not only did I not know much about the process of how people understand new ideas, but I don't think the business world does. Beyond things like story and some cognitive development, and all of that kind of stuff, there's actually a huge body of research and work on how adults learn. And fundamentally, any new idea requires some level of learning. And so that's why I decided to pursue that. And it so far has been absolutely the right decision, even though I am, currently 4 papers behind where I need to be. And,
So,
that's all
so
good.
typical
We'll figure it out.
student then is what you're saying. Yeah.
Exactly. It's nice to know that I haven't changed much in that way.
Well, what's inspiring to me about that, Tamsen, is you are an extraordinarily accomplished professional. Like you say, you've got 25 years into this. You've done so much great work, and yet here you are back in school and
Yeah.
always
I
learning.
love to I do. I love to learn. Well, and I'm also so some of this, I mean, was a doctoral degree necessary? Absolutely not. But the one of the things that struck me is that with all the work that I've done, I have seen that I think the biggest thing I can say is that from what I can see and what I know to be true is that persuasive message design is not a skill that is taught. And I think to some extent it's because nobody's ever really centralized that information. And what is it that we need to say to people so that, what I was saying earlier, we can accelerate the understanding and adoption of new ideas. And so, I may have ideas and I may have a lovely following, which I do. So thank you, people. But it won't get taught unless it won't become the canon. Doesn't become it doesn't have that larger impact until it really is built into what we do. And so this is my kind of starry-eyed idealist part of me that says, well, the only way to get it into what is taught and get it into becoming an actual field of practice is to establish it in academia as a field of practice. And so that was really what drove me to do that.
Yeah. Because when you go on, Amazon and you search for change management books, there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them. And like anything, like almost any management subject, there's thousands upon thousands of books. Why did you feel compelled then to really put the time into writing this one? And how is it going to stand out? How are you carving that niche for it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say that while there are thousands and thousands and thousands of books on change management, there are not as many thousands on change communication. And that is something that I observed. I mean, the first time back in honestly 1998, so whatever that is, 25 years ago, when I first came out of grad school the first time with my MBA, and I was working in a change management consultancy, and I remember because it was my big project, I was assigned to create the communication methodology around change management. But all the work that I've done since, and all the work that I've done with change management consultants since, to a person, they say, we have still not solved the change communication issue. And this as well as I do with story and how we use it to make sense of information. If a change doesn't make sense to people from the get-go, it doesn't matter how beautifully planned the implementation is. If people aren't on board with it, if they're not really bought into it, if there's not any kind of intellectual or emotional investment in it, if they don't even agree with it in principle, then again, there's just this massive amount of effort, time, and money going into these change efforts that won't work because we just haven't captured the hearts and minds of the people who have to make it work in the first place. So that was what I wasn't seeing, was something that really addressed that. And since so much of my work and much of your work too can be adopted from a how-to standpoint, what I really realized is, yeah, I may have these frameworks, you've got frameworks, but I don't think people really understand when they're in change initiatives, what do they need to know about people in order for those
Mhm.
changes to happen?
Well,
And what do they need to know about communicating with people about
yeah.
change to raise the likelihood that those changes will happen? So that was really what drove the book, because I was like, I'm not seeing any books like this on change communication.
Well, was it that first job back in 1998 when you were in change management that you kind of had this run in with some of your own values and beliefs about change versus manipulation and so forth?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So as it turns out, yeah. So it was in that organization where, I mean, and remember, this is like 1998. So we're still kind of from a leadership theory standpoint, we're still at the essentially where the dominant leadership theory is still very top down. You
1998,
haven't
the old fashioned days.
It is still very much line and staff. So, I mean, so people who've come up, through business much more recently are going to be like, well, why was this a big deal? Like, but this is like servant leadership and adaptive leadership. I'm like, that stuff did not exist. And we were not taught that in certainly not at, Southern Methodist University Cox School of Business in 1996 and 7, right? So, so the change so the approach to change was also very top down. And the organization that I worked with, part of what they offered was, in addition to change management consulting, they offered training and workshops to be offered to the folks on whom the change was being imposed. And, on the surface of it, I was like, this is great. We're really helping people understand, how to succeed in this change. And after a while, it started to occur to me, particularly as I was working on this on the methodology behind it. It's like, wait a minute, we're saying that all of this is in the best interest of the employee, but we're actually telling and training the employees to behave in a way that's actually in the best interest of the employer. And I was like, and that kind of gap of persuasion, of information, of we are telling you that this is for your own good, but really it's for our good so that you are more persuadable when it comes to change. Ultimately, I sat back and said, I that is just not a place I can go.
So, Tamsen, the new book, Say What They Can't Unhear. Now, your previous book, The Red Thread, was amazing, and I've been through your Red Thread process. You helped me on my TEDx talk, and I loved it. How do they connect? What was it about the Red Thread that now is being woven through your new book?
Well, there you go. Well, several of the concepts that I brought up explicitly in the Red Thread are in this book. So, namely, that every decision has a story, and that when two truths fight, only one wins. And the Find Your Red Thread is it's a practical, tactical book. It's essentially how do you use, my version of how do you use story structure to architect information, to maximize understanding, even when you're not telling it as a story, right? But ultimately, I am of the belief that when somebody understands the basic principles behind something, that they can then adapt it in all sorts of different ways. And so that, combined with what we were talking about earlier, with just not seeing in particularly business communications, managerial communications, change communications, so much of the newer research that has shown up in other areas like adult learning and cognitive psychology and organizational psychology, not seeing that in this area, that's where I was like, well, let me put the principles out there, because if people really start to understand the principles, then they can determine their best way, whether it's using my red thread or your approach or whatever it might be, to whatever approach works best for them for
Mhm.
implementing those principles. So that's really what I wanted to do. I was like, listen, it doesn't have to be my approach to putting this into play, but these principles are true no matter what approach you choose to use, as long as that approach is in alignment. So I wanted it to have a bigger application right? Just because not everybody's going to sit there and craft their own message. But I think in those moments where you are having a conversation with someone, for instance, just being able to remember things like, oh, right, okay, this person wants to be seen as smart, capable, and good. How can can I in the moment change how I'm thinking about approaching this conversation? I think that ends up being ultimately, I think, more broadly useful to people. And so that's why that's A, how they're connected, but B, why I thought it was important to do something that really spoke to the why of my
Hmm.
approach, in addition to the how, which is what Find Your Red Thread did.
Yeah. Well, before we get into some of your 9 principles, I loved at the beginning of your book where you talked about this idea, the concept around the tuning fork. I
Yes.
hadn't heard that before, and
Yep.
yet it made so much sense, especially when you were trying to collaborate, bring
Yes.
people into
Yes.
your world.
Yes. So the tuning forks, I mean, I've been trying to figure out a place to use that story for a very long time because it
Nailed
truly
it.
is one of my favorite, it is my favorite metaphor for change communication or for effective communication regardless. And so what it is that I saw a demonstration of something that is known in physics as sympathetic resonance. It won't be on the test, don't worry. But the idea of these two metal tuning forks, these kind of like U-shaped metal things that sit on resonating boxes, kind of open wooden boxes. And the teacher struck one of the tuning forks, got that tuning fork to ring its like bright, clear tone. And then he touched that same tuning fork, but the tone continued. And what was happening was the other tuning fork, because it was tuned to the same note, and because that tone from the first one was so clear, the other one picked up the note and started ringing the same note, even though it had never been physically touched by anything other than the sound wave of that first fork. To me, that is the ideal when it comes to change communication, sales, marketing, messaging, anything where we're trying to create a shift of thinking, or behavior. Because ultimately, the longest lasting changes happen when they are internally motivated, when they come from within somebody, and that person on their own decides to continue to think, continue to behave in a certain way. And that's not something that you can do through force. You can get people to act through force. But part of what I do in the book and what I do in my work in my life is I make a very clear distinction between pursuing action, which is short term and can be motivated by outside things, and change, which can only happen from the inside out, from a long term shift in thinking, frame of reference, worldview, perspective. And that seems mystical and magical to people and a hard thing to figure out how to do. But again, that's what I wanted to write the book to help with, which is that it isn't
Hmm.
actually that hard to understand what forces are in play, but it's going to take some practice because this approach of looking past the short-term result to get the longer term one, just isn't how most of this has been orchestrated for a really long time.
Yeah. Tamsen, do you have an example of something maybe you experienced and or read about where it was a very important change
Mm,
management, change
yeah.
situation, and one that actually needed to get done, happen, but the leadership couldn't resonate with its people to make it happen?
Yes. I mean, the first one that comes into play is a personal example, but let me think about an external one. I think that one of the things that I've seen. So one of the things I've talked about in the past is that I moonlighted for 13 years as a Weight Watchers leader, and so many of my lessons about helping individuals achieve transformational change happened in the meeting room, but so many lessons about what not to do from a change communication came actually as a leader to the company with responding to the company.
Hmm.
And I remember there was this all staff meeting, which would happen once a year, and each area would get together, and then what they did was they beamed in the CEO of Weight Watchers at the time. So this is again a number of years ago. And they really wanted, the whole point of these meetings, as they are at any company, is to get everybody fired up, to like get them re-engaged, to get them excited about the new changes, to get them, for us to be out and, advocating for the company and the program. And they had started this process by, reporting on how great Weight Watchers was doing and how awesome everything was and how much all this was happening. And then all these things that they were going to be doing and all these changes they were going to be making, which of course we, the leaders, had to implement. And then someone had, asked the normal question, which was, we haven't gotten a raise as leaders in over 5 years. When is that going to happen? And the immediate response was pretty much silence, as if they hadn't even thought about that. And as if their own kind of belief in all of this would overtake what what it was that the people upon whom this change relied actually cared about most, which is, when is all of this success going to trickle down into our pockets? And so that's what I remember one time. It's just like that stopped a lot of excitement and change right in its tracks. And again, that was just a pattern, unfortunately, that happened over and over again, because there's a point, for instance, where like the area that I was in had been owned by the franchise, rebought by the main company, and the company had different ways of doing things. And again, the way that the company said it was essentially like, well, it's our way or the highway. And they lost a lot of leaders as a result, because the leaders are like, we've been doing this and it's been working for us for a very long time. And it doesn't mean that they were just against against the changes in the first place. One of the things I talk about in the opening chapter of the book, or the introduction of the book, are these 4 audiences for change. And one of them is antagonists, right? Where people are just against the change. But a lot of the people we weren't against it. And a lot of these other leaders weren't against that change of getting bought by the company, by the main company, against it in the beginning. They were actually what I would call ambivalent, meaning they wanted like a lot of the benefits that would come from being part of the new company, but they also wanted to be able to rely on what they knew worked for their own meetings and their own members. So the ambivalence, as I talk about in the book, are so important, because they are, rather than being indecisive, they actually are actively looking for information that will tip them one way or the other. And unfortunately for the company, when they were like, nope, you're doing it this way, and they never even gave those, these long-standing leaders who've been doing this for like 15 or 20 years, any chance to say, could we consider a different way? It just flipped all of those leaders over to antagonists, where then they were fighting against it. And it just ended up being a very tense situation that fundamentally wasn't what was great for ultimately all the people we were there to serve, which are the people who were trying to achieve their health goals. So much about a change comes down to how it's
Well,
presented in the first place. And, there are many, many steps that come after, but I just look at this, and I've seen it over and over again. And I look at it and go, this is a solvable problem. So,
mhm.
hopefully this book is a first step to help more people solve it.
And in that instance, it seems like it's a fundamental problem of leadership, of just being completely disconnected. Just like, why would they not listen to the people in the field, especially in a merger situation, that are the ones that have been doing it and know how to interact with the customer and so forth, versus just coming in and pushing down upon them? Here's what the change is going to
Yeah,
be.
well, because leadership is, we're humans. I mean, I really do try to give people the benefit of the doubt. And while there are absolutely kind of, maliciously intended leadership and organization, yes, fine. I don't think that's what the case was. I think that generally what happens is that we humans are subject to very human cognitive fallacies. And one of them, which, is so dangerous, and most of us aren't even aware that it exists is something called naive realism. And I'm sure nobody wants to be called naive, but fundamentally what it means is it's what's described when you think you have an objective view of the world, and anybody and you're the one that has it. And so I think, which nobody does. Nobody has a truly objective view of the world. There's a theorist named Stephen Brookfield who basically says you cannot escape the cultural streams in which you swim, right? Like that there is that. And so I think what happens is, like, when any change happens, we come to a decision about why it makes sense to us from our point of view, from our worldviews, frames of reference, and all of that. And because it makes so much sense to us, we assume that it will automatically make sense to everybody else.
Mhm.
And we forget that we came to that decision, that decision was built step by step as a story in our heads. And so but the issue is, of course, that once we've decided it's the right change, our brains kind of forget the story that got us there in the first place. And so once it starts to make sense to us, we just assume that kind of just telling people doing this is a good idea. And sometimes we don't even tell them what is the good idea that we don't even tell them what the effect is.
We
We just
just
assume that
assume
you'll
they're
figure
going to
it
get
out.
it.
And
Mhm.
the issue is, and you know this is one of the reasons I love talking with you, Park, that if humans are not given all the pieces of the story that we need for things to make sense, we will fill in the story based on the beliefs, the experiences, the values, the assumptions that we already have. So when you don't say to people, here's why we're doing this, when you don't say to people, this is why we're doing it this way, based on these principles about why we think this is going to work, then people will fill in. And if they haven't had a good experience to date with you thinking about that, not going to fly. And so
Mhm.
that's where, again, I think it is one of those things that, as sentient humans, that once we know about it, we need to be on the lookout for it, just like confirmation bias, where we're looking for things that reinforce what we believe to be true. But I think that more often than not, that's actually what's happening, is that we just think it makes sense. And we think that, I mean, and it does make sense. That's the thing. It does make sense to us. We just forget that other people have a different
Yeah.
worldview, have different assumptions, and that from their perspective, it isn't going to just automatically make sense.
Yeah. Well, we all live in
That's right.
storyland, the stories we
Yep.
tell ourselves, the stories that we believe in, the stories we hear from other people that we either embrace and or push aside. You even talk about story as being an
Yes.
argument. And actually, Tamsen, the first time I read that, I'm like, Tamsen, you've gotten so mean. What do you mean an argument? Its story is about bringing people together. But then the more I read about your
Yep.
position on argument, it started making more
Yeah,
sense to me.
it's a case. It is essentially, a story is arguing for a set of behaviors to achieve, for or against a set of behaviors to achieve a certain outcome. I mean, so, if it's a happy ending, the story is an argument for this is the way to get that thing that this character wanted or needed in the first
Mhm.
place. If it's a sad ending, it's like, this is not the way. Right? Like, and
Yeah.
usually we're being shown what the better way would have been, and we're like watching as they make the wrong decision. We're like, no, like, don't go into that unlit room. That's no, that's the wrong idea. And I mean, if we think about things like fables, like Aesop's fables, then it's, those are very clearly arguing for a particular lesson. But that's what we're talking about. It's not like I want to fight you for something. It is essentially saying, it is reinforcing what our kind of brain stories are, which are establishing a relationship between cause and effect, right? And so
Mhm.
any once upon a time story is creating that case for this is what will happen if these things are true. And so, you know, fundamentally, we collect enough of those as humans or as
Mm-hmm.
organizations in our mind that they become our personal philosophies. And we don't realize it. A lot of those assumptions that are creating that, a lot of those principles that are the basis for which we think that this thing happens or should happen this way, we're not even conscious of. And so, part of what can go wrong and naturally goes wrong when we are making a case for change is that we are leaving those implicit assumptions implicit. But for all the reasons we just talked about, we must make them explicit. We must kind of excavate down
Mm-hmm.
to figure out what's really going on. Why do we really think this is a good idea? So that we can make those things explicit and we can surface them so that they can become the substance of the story that people will tell themselves. And
Yeah.
so it is endlessly fascinating to me, this whole process. But once I started to dig into this, it helped me understand why, as powerful as story is and as powerful as story structure it is, whether it's the red thread or ABT or whatever it might be, story brand or whatever, they don't always work. And again, it could be picture perfect structure, right? And not be persuasive. And I was deeply fascinated by that. And because, yeah,
And it's because they're not the storyteller is not really paying attention to their audience
yeah,
and have done the
or
research and the discovery or even
that's right.
understanding
Or
them, right?
or
Yeah.
there's not a valid or sound argument underneath it. And I know that
Mm-hmm.
starts to get into a little wonk land. I know. But what I mean by that is the argument either isn't complete, it's not logical, meaning this plus this does not equal that. And that's what your story is trying to say. If this happens, this will happen. And people on the surface of it are like, no, I don't agree, or it's missing parts of that story, right? So that, again, that connective
Yeah.
tissue isn't there. And it's one of the things that I was, and still am very soapboxy about with the red thread, about the inclusion of the truth, because back to Aristotle, father of the 3-act storytelling, any story of transformation needs to have that anagnorisis. It needs to have the character has to have that moment where they recognize the true nature of their circumstances, or else change doesn't happen. And it isn't just the conflict, it isn't just the problem, it's this other thing that has to come into play. And so, again, it's this is where I was starting to understand. I'm like, oh, that's why it goes awry, is because either
Mm-hmm.
something's missing or the internal logic doesn't work. Now, I know a lot of people sometimes go, but this is so logical. Like, that's not how people are. And I'm like, well, hey, I will agree that it's logical. It's not rational. Right. And so that's where the thing is, because, what's so fascinating to me is that we do operate on an internal logic, right? If something doesn't feel right to us, if we don't agree, even if we're not conscious of it, the reason why we don't feel comfortable with certain business tactics, things like that, is because the underlying principles, values, beliefs that those practices represent don't align with us. Right? And so that's what I was trying, that's originally where some of this stuff came into, because I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, story isn't where it ends. Story is not the basis of understanding. It's not the basis of, story is the basis of understanding. It's not the basis of agreement. The basis of agreement are the beliefs that sit under the story. And
Mm-hmm.
that's really, I think, for me, that unlocked a lot of new understanding about what really is necessary for someone
Yeah.
to be internally motivated to act.
Yeah, Tamsen, the timing of our conversation is so interesting to me, just the way the universe works out there, being
Yeah.
woo-woo and wonky, if you will. 2 weeks ago, I had a gentleman on the show named Sean Grace, and he's got a new book out that I think you'll find really fascinating if you haven't already heard about it. It's called The Art of the
Oh, okay.
Question. And I brought him in. Sean comes from a very professional musician standpoint, and then got in, and his side hustle was corporate leadership development and so forth, using what he learned as a musician. But he said one of the fundamental breakdowns is that, and kind of like what you're talking about, one of the fundamental breakdowns in change management is truly understanding your audience, what they believe and value, and how do you make a story argument that will bring them into the fold. And what surprised me about his book is so much of the art of the question is about first questioning
100%.
yourself
Yes.
as the leader. And he talks about Aristotle and he talks about Zen. And he says, there's the thinking mind, there's the feeling mind, and then there's the observing mind. And he said, we get caught up in what we think is right, the story we're telling ourselves, and then boom, how that makes us feel, happy, sad, anxious, or whatever. And then we need to back out of that and go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Am I telling myself a truthful, rational story about what's really happening here? So he really is a big proponent of kicking into that observing mind. Now, observe what you're thinking, observe how it's making you feel, and then ask yourself, is that actual reality? So it's kind of playing to what you're talking about is you've got to do that self-examination first before you go in and do this change management.
Absolutely. Because if you cannot, so one of the things that I had this aha, like literally 2 days ago, I was doing one.
The ding.
I had one
Did
of
you
my
have a
ding
go
moments.
off?
That's right. Where I was doing one of my all day kind of core message foundation sessions with a client. And we were talking about this idea of creating this case for your idea, for a change, or the change you represent in the marketplace. And I had been previously talking about the beginning and end of that if you do this, this will do that as the core message. And it is a version of it. But in that, as I was explaining it to her, I ended up I ended up saying it's actually the core claim that you make about something. And that created a ding in my moment, because I was like, that is what a lot of times we're not even clear on what we're claiming. And if we are clear on what we're claiming, that this will do that, right? A lot of times we're just saying, we're going to do this because it will, why do that? Or we need to do that. So what, like, how are we going to get there? And so creating that claim is really important. But even if you look at this from a story structure standpoint, if we just give people like the cause and effect, right? Like, if we do this, we'll get this answer. Well, we get all Fitzgeraldian, right? Where all of a sudden we've skipped the second act. We've skipped what connects those two things together. And so when it comes to what has to be at the core of your understanding about the change, not even the communication, is first and foremost establishing how does this change connect to something that your audience actively and knowingly wants right now. Like actively and knowingly wants, which is where a lot of change goes wrong, because the leadership will talk about it as this big global, we're trying to do X, Y, and Z, like with Weight Watchers, and the leaders, like the people on the front lines, are like, yeah, when do we get more money in our pocket? So it's about figuring out how to tie it to something that people legitimately want. But if we just give people that claim, well, then it's just an assertion, right? There's nothing to support it. Now, what do we typically do? Once we've got a claim, then people, and this is again where we go wrong and why we love stories so much, because what do people do when they're like, back up your assertion? Data, right? But that's not how people that's not how it works, because what we're trying to do from the data is deduce the principle, right? We're trying to figure out from that what it is that you're actually saying. But if we actually start from the position of, let me explain to you using principles that I believe that we all agree are true. So for instance, let's say I'm going to use an example from one of my clients with their permission, where this is a leadership development company. They work with companies that are trying to make sure that their leaders and their company is ready to execute a strategic shift, right? There's going to be a big change that they're making, either internally or externally. They need to make sure that everybody's ready for it. Now, if Vince is just trying to pitch this to a prospect, he's like, well, if you scale accountability, your company will be ready. Why? Right? Like if we just leave it at that, it's not so. And then he could follow it with testimonials and data and all of this other stuff. But what starting with the case does instead, right, is basically it would go, hey, listen, you're facing a strategic shift and you're trying to look to make sure that you have a successful outcome. Well, we can agree it's true, right? That accountability is the ownership of outcomes. That in order to get that successful outcome, we need to make sure that people are feeling ownership of that. So obviously, if we're trying to figure out how to do this, accountability plays a key part. But if we only have one person accountable, that's not going to work either, right? Because success requires execution at scale. So that's why, right, in order to be ready for strategic shift, we believe that we need to scale accountability through the organization. Now let's give you the evidence about how we do that, how that works, why that works exactly the way. Because what we've done is using principles that people would find difficult to disagree with, right? That accountability is the ownership of outcomes. Success requires execution at scale. We're able to argue for a new approach using something that feels comfy and familiar to the people that we're talking to. And we're able to get them to agree in principle with the approach. Then we can start to move to getting them to agree in practice by showing them that information. But again, from a story and a learning standpoint, what we've done is we've created the grounding. We've laid down some Velcro onto which kind of the more detailed, more nuanced information, the stories, the case studies that can sit on top of. Because now we're saying, look, this stuff, all of this stuff is related to accountability. All of these things are related to scale. All of these things are related to the kind of emergent properties that happen when you put them together. And ultimately, all of this is possible because we've gotten underneath and really excavated those principles behind why Vince believes that's the best approach. So by surfacing that with a prospect, he's very quickly to establish whether there's alignment, where that alignment is, where there's not alignment, and where, if anywhere, there's opportunity for kind of renegotiation or coming at it from a different direction.
Is it too simplified thinking to say, I was just digesting everything you were saying there, is to start at the most foundational point of, all right, I'm a leader, I've got a change going on. My very first question I need to ask myself and then proof out through my colleagues is, what do they value in relation to this change? Even though they don't know what the change is, they don't even know it's coming, but I've got to do my due diligence. What do they value?
And I would say that the place to start there is, what do they value in terms of what is something that they're already pursuing? I mean, and I like to frame it as a question. There's a lot of great research in appreciative inquiry and in linguistics that show that when we kind of frame something as a question, how do I get X, rather than how do we fix problem, like then we have a problem, let's fix it, right? We are open to many, many more ideas. And so the most important thing, first thing for any leader to do is to say, what question, what is the urgent and important question that our team is actively and knowingly asking right now? Like, for which this change, right, will accelerate their movement towards it. And this
the art of the question,
that's
right?
It is not it. And what's so important about this is not you saying, I know better than you, right? This is not
right.
Because if you think about it, it's almost like physics in the sense that if people are already moving towards a direction, then what you're doing is saying, I'm going to draft this change, kind of like operate in the draft of that change, and just actually kind of boost you towards that, rather than getting someone to move direction and saying, I know you want this, but I need you to go over here right now. Takes way more effort for you and for them in order to move. So this is really about just moving in that same direction. And oh, by the way, it's much more effective for marketing too.
Oh, God. Yeah. I was working with an executive, very successful executive in Toronto not too long ago, teaching them about the and, but, therefore, and how you place your audience at the center of the story. You demonstrate that you appreciate what they want and
Yeah.
why it's important to them, but you then roll out why they don't currently have it because of such and such a problem. Therefore, here's the way forward. And the guy basically said, Park, I think this ABT thing is total BS. And I go, why is that? And he goes, because what's been effective for me is everyone knows how experienced I am. They all know how knowledgeable I am. They just want to hear what to do. So all I do is tell them what to do. And I go, how's that working for you? And there was a long, long pause. He didn't even know how to answer that. And I said, I don't know, talking down to people, pushing stuff onto them, in my experience, has never been very effective. Whenever someone pushes something onto you, what do?
Resist. You
push
push back.
back.
Yeah, absolutely.
Story is a pull
That's right.
strategy, but you got to really understand who they are, what they want, why it's important to them, why don't they currently have it, and how are you there to help
That's
them
right.
get it.
Yeah. I mean, it's fundamentally where it comes down to, and I know we're at the end of our time, but for me, what this, one of the big
Yes.
things that this comes down to is by taking this approach to persuasion, which by the end of the book, I hope people realize that it actually really isn't about persuading at all. It's just about kind of owning your own philosophy of change and putting that out there. And by doing that, what it does, I think, is it puts the risk of change where it belongs. It puts it on the person asking for it. And every other approach is basically saying, trust me, this is it for your own good. But we all know, I mean, we've all experienced, like, we trust ourselves, over time, we trust ourselves and our own experience more than anything that anybody else will ever tell us. And so that's what this is about. It's about saying, I believe that because every decision has a story, because the stories that we agree with are based on the beliefs we already have, that the best way to build buy-in, right, is to build a story using elements your audience already agrees with. Like, it's about saying, and if you don't agree with that, that's okay. You're not my client, right? And I mean, I don't know how you disagree with it, but again, it's totally fine if you do. Or if there's something else where you hear the case and it feels stronger for you. But I think, like, that's what it comes down to, is fundamentally, when to say something that someone can't unhear, what you're doing is stating a recognizable truth, something that they recognize as true immediately, not because you've piled them with data and facts, that they recognize it as true because they've seen it, they've experienced it themselves. And it becomes something they can't unhear when it either creates, crystallizes, or corrupts how they see the world right now. Because now they've got to do something with that thing that they know to be true. And either it starts to open up a whole new way of seeing something for them, because now they see that, oh, that's in fact true. Or it crystallizes, like, that is a beautiful way to say it. And now you've finally given me what the issue is. Or corrupts it, because all of a sudden it's like, oh, I actually can't do what I was doing before because of that. And that's really what all of this ends up doing in long term. And it's so exciting to be able to talk to you about it.
And that triggers the ding in their life that you speak so much
Thank
about
you.
in yours. You've got a freebie. You've got
I
something
do.
to
So
offer our people here.
if people go to thecompactcase.com, then there's a kind of back of the envelope way to start this case on your own. And then with the book, you can start to refine it. If you want even more information about that, that's what my whole Message Design Institute is designed to help with. But compactcase.com.
And I imagine they can get the book about anywhere anybody sells a
They
book.
can. Yes. Anywhere books are sold. But I haven't seen it in person yet. Like, I haven't seen it in an actual bookstore yet, so I can't wait for that.
Oh, awesome. Well, Tamsen, thank you so much. I know how swamped you are.
My pleasure.
Just great to have you back here again.
Lovely to talk with you. Thanks, Park.
And congrats on the new book.
Thank you.
Take care. I hope you enjoyed this week's show, and please share it with anyone you know who would benefit from Tamsen's ideas on how to use effective storytelling in change management and to really make change work in your organization. Hey, if I can help you make storytelling work in your organization, I know I can, please reach out to me. I can teach your people in person, we can do virtual training, we can do a hybrid of both, and I've got all kinds of resources that are going to help you. Brands like Walmart Canada, the Home Depot, the U.S. Air Force, Barrows Healthcare, Dell, Intel, you name it, have taken part in and rely on the Business of Story Mastery courses. So if I can help your team, especially in quarters 1 and 2 this coming year for sales enablement, sales conferencing, getting your marketing story straight and showing your people how to build a common storytelling culture within your organization to help them get what they want out of their careers while you are getting what you want out of revenue generation, then shoot me a note to park@businessofstory.com. Big shout out to Caden Howell. Thank you so much for editing the show. Darius Holbert for our marvelous custom theme music, and for Marissa Hill for your ongoing community development and support of our program. I hope you will join me next Monday when Pia Silva, author of Badass Your Brand, The Impatient Entrepreneur's Guide to Turning Expertise into Profit, will join us to show you how to do exactly that. Brand badassery is Pia's right it. Until then, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself, so make that one epic. And thank you so much for listening.